So the Permian was the last period within the Paleozoic era. The Paleozoic translates to ancient life. So you had a lot of really obscure animals during this time that we wouldn't recognize today. From the famous Cambrian age Burgess Shale, you'd have weird animals like Anomalocaris swimming around. As we go later on in the Paleozoic, we'd have famous animals like Dunkleosteus. In the Devonian, we would have animals like Adestus within the Carboniferous. And now we're going to be reaching the Permian, our last period within the Paleozoic. So what makes the Permian interesting to you guys?
I think it would be the fact that it's the very last section of the Paleozoic. We get an entire, over 200 million year history, and then you get to the last part of the Paleozoic, which is the Permian, and then everything kind of goes to hell. We've got, small, minuscule mass extinctions and some large mass extinctions in the middle, but the Permian is recognized as being the period with the biggest mass extinction in Earth's history. I mean, much bigger than the in Cretaceous mass extinction. So it's where everything kind of goes to hell. And it's unfortunate because we have some incredible organisms and plants living in that time. And then you got, boom, a huge mass extinction that wipes everything out. So I think as regards to the life, I think it's interesting, but I think as regards to being the period with the largest mass extinction to have ever occurred, I think that's its own interesting topic within itself.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get towards that end mass extinction, the great dying, if you will. Yeah,
So
that
depressing.
was a very interesting. That was definitely a very interesting event in Earth's history, and one that was quite literally life-changing. I mean, we wouldn't have dinosaurs or things like that if we didn't have
Yeah,
that great
it
dying.
really sets up the timeline for the age of dinosaurs.
It really does, yeah. And with the Permian, you kind of see two different, or I guess three sects of animals we can group them as. You'd have one that would be the Permian survivors, the animals that move on from there into the Mesozoic. You'd have ones that are already like just hanging by a thread within the Permian. There's a few lineages like that where you only see like certain families or not great diversity within their taxa that are still like clinging on within the Permian. And then you have animals that like significantly radiated in the Permian that you have great diversity with, but they don't make it past into the Triassic, or they make it past, but they're very weak into the Triassic and they don't make it into the Jurassic after that.
Well, and yeah, I think that's kind of what I would go with for the Permian being interesting as well. Like what makes it so interesting is it's really the last time in Earth's history where the life on the planet was alien compared to kind of what we expect now, right? You look in the oceans, for example, and you don't have modern sharks, at least. You have other things that are cartilaginous, but they're not modern sharks. You can look also, we have tons of ammonites around. We have the reef systems that are entirely different. We don't have modern corals yet. We don't have scleractinian corals. We have instead rugose and tabulate corals. Excuse me. So there's just this massive change, and that transfers onto land too, where we have all of these really large amphibian groups, or at least amphibian relative groups in the temnospondylus and some of those others. But those aren't like that today. The closest thing we get to things like that, at least as far as amphibians are concerned, are the giant salamanders in Asia, and those aren't even approaching many of the same sizes. They're large, don't
Right.
get me wrong, but they're not approaching quite the same sizes. And that's just one example. So it's this very strange thing where before that extinction that Cam was talking about, you have this very alien world, and then after that, you start to see the beginnings of what would become the world that we live in.
Yeah. And when we look at the Permian, if we're talking like crown group sharks that are alive today, there's none that we know of that are definitively crown group sharks. If we expand that out into Neoselacians as a whole, you would have a true shark, or at least one that I would consider a true shark, a Synecodus antiquus from the early Permian of Russia. But that's really it as far as your true sharks. And then we have the anachronistids that are also around, but those are a little bit more controversial because they don't have the same histology that we would have in your true sharks. Batoids are a little bit different histologically too, so there's a little bit of a mess going on with that. But yeah, there's very few taxa that would fit into our crown group Neoselacians or anything like that. The the Permian was really dominated, at least in the oceans, by your ratfish side of the lineage of the chondrichthyan lineage. You'd have Helicoprion. That's probably the most famous
Oh yeah.
Permian chondrichthyan. That would belong into Chondrichthycephali. Another really cool one that we have here in Arizona is Megatenopatalis, which is basically a pteranodont style tooth, but it's basically the size of megalodon teeth, which is absurd. It's really cool. But yeah, there's some really interesting holocephalans and euchondrocephalans within the Permian. You'd also have on the elasmobranch side of things in Arizona, we get Kybobvenator, which is a coelacanth that gets the serrated teeth. Those are wild. And yeah, there's some really cool chondrichthyans within the Permian.
And really quick on those chondrichthyans, talking about Arizona and Kybobvenator, there was someone who was very into paleontology and never found a grad school, but was very dedicated to the sharks and the Kaibab limestone and became the world expert on them and had plenty of publications. So if you're someone listening to this and you want to get into paleontology, find what your interest is. Like I will just reiterate, find your interest because it's a small field. You can become an expert in something and contribute to the field. You just need to make sure you're going through, your rigorous scientific method of what question are you asking? How are you answering it? And there's
Yeah,
plenty more to be learned.
I
yeah,
want to add something real quick, just about the Permian as a geological setting and how important it is today. So there's a structure that's down in western Texas and it goes into New Mexico called the Permian Basin, and it's essentially the thickest sequence of rocks in the world from this unit. And much of America's oil comes from these marine layers, and it doesn't produce the charismatic synapsid, or what we used to call the mammal-like reptiles or these big cool sharks. But what it does preserve is lots and lots of amazing invertebrate communities, and it is like one of the most economically important regions in the entire world. So we kind of owe the Permian period a lot in terms of our infrastructure, which is kind of neat.
yeah. So let's touch on the mammal-like reptiles that you talked about. So what are they and why are they not considered mammal-like reptiles anymore?
I'm glad you asked because I have some props that I used at a presentation at AMP, and these are 3D prints. And I'm sorry, one of them he broke in transport. But if you take a dinosaur like
Mm.
Camarasaurus here, this is a 3D print of a skull. You can see that behind his eyeball in the orbit here, there's two holes, the inferior temporal fenestra and the superior temporal fenestra. So this guy is a dinosaur. He's an archosaur, and he's what's called a diapsid. So this means he has these two sort of temple holes for that anchor jaw muscles. So this is the same condition you see in a bird, an alligator, a lizard. But we as humans are what are called synapsids, like Dimetrodon here. So Dimetrodon, here's his eyeball, and right behind it is only one hole. And ours is a little modified because we have a zygomatic arch. But the world in the Permian was dominated by creatures like this instead of creatures like this. And these animals didn't rise to fruition in terrestrial ecosystems until a lot of these guys went extinct. And these are pretty diverse and they're found throughout the world. And there's sort of different stages of the Permian where different of these groups are more prevalent. And by basically the end of the Permian, all that's left of these guys are the group that eventually become mammals and these weird things, which are called dicynodonts, which kind of look like a mixture of a rhinoceros and a parrot. So
And why do we call them stem mammals rather than mammal-like reptiles nowadays?
yeah, so the term mammal-like reptile is, in my opinion, not a bad term because they have a mosaic of traits that kind of look like mammals and reptiles. The skull condition is much more like a mammal. A lot of them, like Dimetrodon here, which this might not be the best example because it's got big sharp teeth all throughout the mouth. And what's kind of amazing too is it actually has pterygoid teeth, kind of like a squamate.
Oh, neat. I didn't know that. That's neat.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? um, but superficially, they probably looked and acted a bit like modern day reptiles, in modern day, which are mostly diapsids. So it's kind of a like it's a fine term when you're sort of learning about paleontology, but when you really get into the cladistics and everything, they really are stem mammals because they're the or early synapsids. I kind of like that term better because they predate mammals in geological time, but they also are the building blocks of their anatomy, and they're essentially our ancestors. So Dimetrodon here is not the ancestor of human beings per se, but it's part of a grade of these guys called plesiosaurs, which at one point are pretty much the base of the group that includes mammals.
And what's cool about Dimetrodon is it's I guess the most famous dinosaur that isn't a dinosaur. Like everyone talks about dinosaurs and you'll see like a Dimetrodon picture. It's got that big sailback, kind of superficially resembling like a Spinosaurus, but they're not
It's
dinosaurs.
always in the little toy kits that you get with
Yes.
your kid. And it's like
Yeah.
the one thing that isn't a dinosaur that it gets listed as one.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's when you're learning about ancient life, I think it is one of those things where like, you learn more progressively. So I think if you're telling like a 4-year-old that, that's fine. Sure, they'll get it. And then, when they're 6, you start telling them like, okay, well, there's these different groups, they have different parts of their anatomy and such. It's the same thing as like learning anything, right? You don't start a kid on
Right.
calculus. You start them on 2 + 2.
Hmm. Yeah. Dimetrodon is definitely one of the gateway animals into the Permian, or at least people's interests into the Permian. I'd say that the two icons for the Permian would be Dimetrodon and then the whorl-tooth shark or buzzsaw shark, Helicoprion, which isn't a shark either. Like I said before, those would have been more along the ratfish side of the family tree for chondrichthyans, Euchondrocephalin. They belong within the order Eugenodoniforms. This entire order are the whorl-tooths. So you'd have before Helicoprion, you'd have Adestus. That's another famous whorl-tooth shark. And then you would have other ones such as like Cassiotis, Agassiz, things like that that didn't really they weren't like adestoid like the Adestus and Helicoprion would. So they'd have a little bit different tooth morphology, but still very cool nonetheless.
I think for the thing with the Metrodon is you also have there's so many different skeletons concentrated along the American West. I mean, down in Texas and in Oklahoma, you have literal like bone beds of skeletons of Dimetrodon and other Permian reptiles. It's just ridiculous of how concentrated it is. And then we also got them up in Canada as well. Uh,
Well, I think that's really interesting though, but when you're thinking about this time period, you need to really consider the paleogeography because
right.
everything's all together in Pangea at this time. And everything from Arizona to parts of Canada were along the equator. And that's really where we're finding most of these Dimetrodon species. In fact, the first one was found in Canada, but we just had part of a jaw and it wasn't recognized as Dimetrodon until much later. And by that point, everyone already knew it as Dimetrodon, so there's no reason to change the name. Because otherwise it would have been known as Bathognathus now. And now it's just Dimetrodon borealis instead.
Dimetrodon's a better name.
I agree.
It's especially easier to pronounce when you're like a budding young paleontologist as a kid, and Dimetrodon's so easy to say. That's one of the first things that people can like actually pronounce. But yeah, what were some of the other synapsids that were around during the Permian?
I think you got a Dilophosaurus, which I mean that is also found in the Carboniferous, but it is also found in the Permian. It's similar to, in fact, it's in the same Pelycosaur group, but I believe it's a vegetarian rather than a carnivorous animal. So,
Mhm.
Which one is
Yeah.
the vegetarian?
a
Sorry.
Dilophosaurus.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to get up. My kid keeps trying to come in here. And it's like, you're 5, I get it. But let me finish recording.
Then you also got something called, I love this animal. I call it the boomerang head, Diplocaulus, that amphibian from the Permian. Oh, it's just so weird.
There is apparently a fossil of Diplocalus, or a few of them, which seemingly may have been fed on by Dimetrodon or another one of the large predators. Where just like the tip of the Diplocalus's head is taken out. So if you
Oh,
have,
wow.
your boomerang shape, there's just this little divot right at the tip of the snout. And there were a few of them all together. So it seems like Diplocalus was doing this kind of like hibernating behavior during drought or something. And then it was dug up by Dimetrodon, Ariops, one of these other large amphibians that would have been predatory. But I think this is also a really interesting time when you're looking, especially at the beginning of the Permian, because you've heard me say predators all these times. Diplocalus, also a predator, would have probably been eating small fish and stuff. At this point, herbivory in large herbivores was not super widespread. Sure, we have Adaphosaurus, but that's the only real lineage that's actually approaching that kind of herbivory. Instead, we have a lot more carnivores. And again, that's just because plants are new on the land, but also animals, or at least vertebrate life, is new on the land.
Our,
That
our,
changes as you get into the later Permian, which is really interesting. But yeah, in the early
Yeah.
Permian, there's not many plant eaters, but by the end of it, there's some pretty cool looking, kind of scary looking plant eaters. Yeah.
Yeah, what was it? Oh yeah. So I wanted to get back on those amphibians. So how closely related are those amphibians to modern amphibians?
So Diplocaulus, as you would probably call that an amphibian, a kind of a gradistic sense. However, he's not actually part of the modern amphibian lineages. There's a couple different types of amphibians at this time. The very very beginnings of modern amphibians, which are called lissamphibians, are probably showing up there. But Diplocaulus is a thing called a leptospondyle, which is a term for its condition of its vertebra. So you had that guy and a bunch of relatives, and then you had temnospondyls, which are doing a slightly different thing with their vertebra. They kind of it's about like how the centra and the neural arches are kind of interlocking, and that includes things like you guys mentioned Ariops. I grew up calling it Eriops. That was one of my favorites growing up. And then you have within, I believe, within leptospondyls, um, my notes here, make sure. Yes. So you have these things called microsaurs, and then uh, Nitridia, which are another, they show up in the Carboniferous. And I believe that one includes Diplocaulus. And then there's these things called astopods, which are kind of these superficially snake-like amphibians. It's a pretty awesome diversity of these things. And a lot of these um, things that we're calling amphibians, it gets a little fuzzy because the old term for them is actually like reptilomorpha, where you have animals like Diadectes, and then even some of the temnospondyls. And double check me if this one's a temnospondyl, but later in the Permian, you have amphibians that are like pretty much terrestrial, like Cacops. And these are all these creatures. We'll have to show images of them because they are so funny looking. They don't really have the proportions of modern day salamanders. A lot of them have gigantic heads or tiny little heads. They're doing really interesting things with their teeth, where they're just lining their palates with teeth. So there's a pretty awesome diversity of them, and that changes through the Permian. And basically, by the Triassic, all that's left are the temnospondyls and modern day list amphibians. So if you guys keep up with your amphibian news, like I tried to do, there was a Caecilian from the late Triassic. I believe it's one of the earliest Caecilian fossils. It's from the Chinle. That was, and Caecilians are these sort of superficially worm-like amphibians that are around today. But that's all that's left. But if you time traveled back to the Permian, it would be a big slimy amphibian world, which is full of them.
It is the oldest Sicilian. I have actually seen that material out at Petrified Forest.
Oh, cool.
Oh, neat.
And so it's great because they were doing all this microsite stuff, sifting through the sediment and finding these teeny tiny pieces of bone to put back together. And in the words of Adam Marsh, one of the paleontologists out there, we went from 0 Triassic Sicilians to now we have almost 100. And it's largely just the lower jaws, but they have really distinctive double rows of teeth and like these
Yeah.
little tubes that the teeth sit in. So it's clearly a Sicilian. But that kind of helps to unite the caecilians with salamanders and frogs as being very closely related, because there's been some ideas that genetically we think these things split back at least early Permian. But when we're looking at the fossil record, it's really hard to know, okay, well, where were they all splitting from each other right there, or did they evolve in separate groups? So some of the idea was maybe salamanders and frogs evolved from the temnospondyls, but actually maybe the caecilians evolved from the lepospondyls. What this seems like is instead they're all one group, and it's still hard to say exactly what they evolved from. I like the
Yeah.
temnospondyle idea with things like the amphibamiforms, I believe it is,
Hmm.
a little bit more. But we're finding more pieces. They actually also have an early frog from some of those Triassic sediments. Not anything that's diagnostic to say it's a specific species, but we're starting to find more of these early lissamphibians. And so hopefully we'll start being able to find some of those from the late Permian and being able to understand really where they were evolving from, which group of these older amphibians they really showed up out of.
And what were some of the archosaurs that would have been around during the Permian? Because that's what we see as a predominant group within the Triassic, especially in the Chinle Formation.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if there's true stem archosaurs
There's
or
there's some Archosauriforms,
archosauriforms. Yeah, I'm
um,
trying to.
including potentially some early turtle relatives, but that's also up
Yes.
for debate whether or not turtles are Archosauriforms and related to that. I would say yes,
Yeah.
based on the genetic data, but it's hard to say for sure. Um, and that's largely just because they were such a small part of a lot of those ecosystems. Uh,
Hmm.
there's a lot of biases towards collecting larger fossils, and these animals would not have been large. The largest definitive archosaur, or the first definitive archosaur rather, is Euparkeria, which wasn't very large. It was maybe, a foot and a half long, so well less than a meter. And we have plenty of them from one bone bed in South Africa, which is great, but they're not big. Like if it wasn't for the fact there were a ton of them, we would not know as much about them as we do.
And what age were they from?
I believe they're actually now middle Triassic as opposed to early Triassic. I think that was redated recently.
Interesting.
But so we're missing this very early part of this clade's evolution. And so maybe it does go back as far as the late Permian. I would say it probably does just based on the very rapid diversity we get in that group.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And
But it's
there's
so hard
true.
to know for sure.
Yeah, totally. There's true Archosauromorphs, so Protosaurus and Archosaurus proper, which I didn't know existed until yesterday, are both considered in that group. But yeah, as Ezekiel just said, true Archosaurs, it's really hard to know when they show up.
Hmm.
They're probably around though.
Yeah.
Almost certainly
Yeah.
around. Just very small numbers. And again, size bias. Why would you collect this little lizard looking thing that's this big, that's relatively small, when instead you can collect an entire Pariosaur, which is from maybe another reptile group, depending on how you define it, that actually lost both of those fenestra, which Joel was talking about, and became totally synapsid. So essentially, they don't have any of those holes in the skull for those muscle attachments. They're doing something totally different. But they have some really large animals there, like Scutosaurus.
Yeah,
Scutosaurus?
I think
Yeah.
it's Scutosaurus. Yeah,
I'm like, I always get Scutosaurus and Scutellosaurus mixed up. One of them is a
I do
dinosaur and one
too.
of them is not.
Yeah.
Which is like this big, like, probably weighing about a ton, armored animal that would have been walking around in the late Permian eating all these plants. This is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, where we get these really weird herbivorous animals in the late Permian. And it's really interesting to see that because now suddenly we do have large reptiles in the Permian, but also the predators are mostly gorgonopsids, which are closer to the mammals. So you're getting all this kinds of weird diversity. And that's kind of what I was talking about at the beginning, where it's this alien world.
Let's
Yeah,
talk about
I
the
was going to mention
Gorgonopsid.
the I was just about to
Yeah.
mention the Gorgonopsids. Yeah, I believe they're one of the very first saber-toothed animals that we get in the fossil record. And I believe they're the top predators at the time during the late Permian. And yeah, I haven't seen like any fossil material, but I have seen casts of the skulls, and the stuff that they're pulling out of the Karoo Basin is just gorgeous preservation.
So I guess we should back up a little and talk about the larger group that produces all the really, in my opinion, all the really cool terrestrial animals in the Triassic, which is called, they're called therapsids.
Yeah, there
And
we go.
so therapsid is a group that comes out of these early synapsids, and there's a couple major groups that we are technically therapsids as human beings, because this group is thought to have mammals shot off of this at some point, but it also includes the dinocephalians, which in my opinion are the coolest animals ever.
Yeah, I agree. Those are pretty
The
cool.
dicynodons, the gorgonopsids, and the dicynodons. So all these really cool animals come out of this one group, and we happen to be part of that, which is kind of cool.
Hmm.
And dinocephalians are the best ones that come out of there.
So Joel, you said that you have some background with gorgonopsids and things like that, especially I think you said with your artwork.
Yeah, over the years, so I actually have a training. I'm trained as an artist and an art historian before I got into paleo, and I found myself in undergrad drawing a lot of Permian stuff, both invertebrates and vertebrates. I did these stratigraphic art. They're kind of Ray Troll style, like cartoon stratigraphy,
Hmm.
and I ended up doing a lot of Permian stuff with that because I had some commissions from like petroleum people. And in there, I tried to sneak organopsids and things. But yeah, and I started with Andy Heckert in his Triassic lab. So all these animals are sort of like tangential to our lab, and we're very interested in all these faunal turnovers that happen from the end of the Permian to the late Triassic. But yeah, I am kind of in love with these guys, even though right now I'm working on Cretaceous stuff, which is as far away as you can get. But
Hmm.
yeah, I'll talk about real quick the Dinocephalians. So this is a group that kind of predate the Gorgonopsids. The name literally means like terrible head, and there's this whole diversity of them, mostly in the Middle Permian. What's really sad is that in North America we have a lot of Middle Permian rocks, but most of them are marine and they're like made of bryozoans and brachiopods. They're really interesting to study. They come from these very interesting climatic conditions. We should also probably mention that at the very start of the Permian, it's basically an ice age, which was induced from the insane carbon suck that was going on in the Carboniferous period. So you had these forests which were exploding and they were sucking up carbon dioxide, and they were reducing the carbon dioxide count in the atmosphere to the point that we actually the world sort of glaciated. And then by the end of the Permian, it's the complete opposite, where you have these insane volcanics that are going on in Siberia, um, which basically kill off all these lineages. But by the middle Permian, you have some really interesting tetrapods like the Dinocephalians. And what's cool about them is they occupy both like mega herbivore niches and mega predator niches. So you have these really scary 20-foot long creatures like Ankylosaurus, which is from, um, I believe that's from Russia. I think you find these guys in both Russia and South Africa. No, I think Ankylosaurus from South Africa. And then you have these really funny looking ones like Struthiocephalus, which are these really long faced. They're from this the same group that includes moss chops, and so they're sort of these like gorilla postured, butt headed creatures that were probably using their heads for combat. A lot of them have big scary teeth that were either for eating or fighting or for display. And then basically by the end of the Permian, they're all gone. So this is just like this couple million years where you get these really interesting critters rocking around. And we have no record of them in North America, which is really sad. But
Hmm.
yeah, the tympanocephalids are the ones with the big like butt heads.
And let's talk about some of the other lineages that we see. So we see them earlier in the Paleozoic, but they like dwindle, like just hanging on by a thread into the Permian. So Cam, you said that there were trilobites, that those would fit into that category.
Yeah, so the we had a massive diversification of trilobites in the Cambrian, But it really, after the Cambrian, we kind of get this extinction event. And then after that, you start to see lineages go down one by one by one. And you only had maybe two or three lineages that were around in the Carboniferous. And again, you get a decrease in the diversification of trilobites until you get to one group by the end of the Permian, the Proetids. Most trilobites during that time were very small, about maybe the largest trilobite that I've seen in the Carboniferous and Permian are about maybe an inch, 2 inches long. And by the time you get up to the late Permian, I mean, they reduce in size to about an inch and then they completely go extinct. So yeah, the trilobites were, I mean, they've been around for over about 200 million years until the late Permian, until they die. So it's a really interesting group, and it's one that I love to study because, again, you have this major diversification event in the Cambrian, and then by the end of the Permian, they're completely gone.
Hmm.
When we see that with a number of other arthropod groups as well, I think two of the most notable for me that I think are interesting are going to be uh, chelicerates. And so when you're looking at chelicerates, it's things
Oh yeah,
related to spiders and scorpions and such. But you're actually looking in the marine realm, so it's horseshoe crabs and it's the eurypterids, which are sea scorpions. They didn't have venom like scorpions do. But what you see is a lot of these started moving into fresh water throughout the Paleozoic. And then they start to dwindle quite a bit, including some of those freshwater ones during the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, the Ice Age, which was talked about earlier. And you see that with the Eurypterids as well. And a few of those Eurypterids hang on until the very end Permian, but then they die out as well. And I think that's just a kind of a one single point for this is happening in freshwater. But I think the marine realm is really where that takes off when you're looking at other things like brachiopods and
yeah,
such.
Yeah. Another prevailing group throughout a lot of the Paleozoic is the conodonts, whereas those things take a huge plummet in the late Paleozoic, and in the Permian they're just like hanging on by a thread.
yep.
And they somehow managed to make it in the Triassic too before eventually going completely extinct. But those are some wild animals.
Yeah, so if you're not aware, the conodonts are these essentially tubes that are related to vertebrates, but probably not actual vertebrates. They'd be the name is escaping me now. Let's search the C.
Oh, chordates.
Chordates. There you go. I'm still putting a CH there because we were talking about chondrichthyes so much earlier. Yeah, chordates. And so they're jawless. They would have had multiple rows of teeth that they still couldn't necessarily move like a jaw, but could have used to, rake the ocean for filter feeding or something like that. It's hard to know exactly what they were doing because they're totally extinct. And we've only had like an actual body fossil to see that it's basically just a tube for 20 years or so, maybe. I think it was found in Scotland, I believe. But they were very numerous, and they're actually really important for things like the Permian Basin that was mentioned earlier, where you're getting these teeth that chemically change under different geologic conditions when they're buried. And then you can use that to estimate what kind of conditions would be good for oil or whatever else you're finding. It's really useful for understanding stratigraphy and kind of geologic conditions under the earth.
Hmm.
I will add real quick. I think they're actually considered vertebrates now, which is wild. So they're in the club.
Okay.
Yeah, which means like they should be being talked. They should dominate SVP, but I don't think that's gonna happen.
Another true vertebrate, the acanthodians, those are now considered stem chondrichthyans, and they're a paraphyletic group. So you see those have pretty cool diversity within the earlier parts of the Paleozoic that vertebrates are actually found in. So like in the Devonian especially. But as we go into the Permian, you really see a decline in the diversity of your acanthodians. You see like acanthodes, for example, but you don't see all of this like tremendous diversity that was around before because they really got their niches replaced by other fish and other like more I guess you would call them like crown group chondrichthyans, which is basically all of the chondrichthyans outside of the acanthodians.
Another group that a friend of mine is working on right now that are not chondrichthyans, but they're actually closer to us as tetrapods, but they make it through the Permian and do well in the Mesozoic are the lungfish. So lungfish, I think for the most part, are terrestrial or not terrestrial, but they're freshwater at this point. And you find lungfish all over the Karoo Basin, and there's a couple families that I think go extinct in the Permian, but otherwise, like the ceratodontids, they make it through, and the what do they call the uh, I'm blanking on my other lungfish families right now. That'll come to me. but lungfish make it through just fine, as do coelacanths. You find them all across the Chinle and the Moenkopi. So in terms of Sarcopterygian, non-tetrapod Sarcopterygian diversity, it's okay.
Yeah. And if we're talking about freshwater animals, I think that the coelacanths dominate for the Permian. So we're looking at like Orthacanthus in the US, those can get you can get teeth that are pretty decently sized out of the Permian. So these would have been, I don't know, probably ecologically like a bull shark or something like that. I guess that would be a good comparison for them. They,
Gnathorhizids, that's the other family of lungfish I was trying to think of. Sorry.
yeah, you're good. But yeah, so coelacanths were very widespread and they filled in some macropredatory roles within freshwater ecosystems. They had a dipelodont tooth design. So, like we talked about Venator earlier, and that would have had a cladodont style tooth design, which is a lingually expanded tooth base with a longer median cusp and then lateral cusplets on both sides of that. Whereas a dipelodont tooth design is basically you have two principal cusps that are placed laterally from each other. And sometimes you'll have like little cusplets in the median area of the tooth, but it's still different. And they also have a lingually expanded tooth base, which is different than most of the true sharks that we see, for example, which are a lot flatter comparatively. You do see some true sharks, such as Chlamydosalacus, that have a lingually expanded tooth base, and it's previously been hypothesized that these were like an archaic cladodont that somehow made it into contemporary times, but that's since been disproven, and those would have been within or are within hexanchoforms. But anyways, you see these dipelodont tooth designs with coenacanthoforms. You see a another dipelodont coenacanthamorph within the marine realm, which would be like Branchinella, things like that. Those are also in the Permian. But within the end Permian mass extinction, you still see some coelacanths make it through, and they don't really get as prevalent as they were in the Permian, and they eventually die off within the Triassic. So, like in the Chinle, there's Moriodontis, which would have been a freshwater coelacanth. But I mean that it's such a small remnant of what they were before. Like if
And
you're
I,
looking at like the Wellington Formation, for example, you see these coelacanth teeth everywhere.
well, I think this is a good point that we can bring up too, is we're seeing a lot of this decline because there's a number of really big climatic events. Again, you're changing from this really cold Earth during the glaciation into a much warmer event. And it's really easy to just point at the Siberian traps, but there's also the Emetian traps in South China that were erupting at the same time. And these are massive volcanoes that are producing all the steam because they're erupting underwater. And so you get what's called mega breccia, where you have pieces of the earth that were blown up by these steam eruptions that are hundreds of meters long, that are just emplaced in what's essentially the rest of the mud and sand that was blown up. And so it was this really confusing thing for the geologists that were first looking there until they started seeing these other signs of these eruptions. And so you see this decline, especially in the marine realm, because so much of the ocean acidification and stuff that goes on affects those groups more. And so I think we can look at that a little more too. And I think Cam's mentioned that he's been looking at more of the marine realm than any of us have. So I think Cam would be a good person to ask some about that. Do you have any opinions on the marine extinctions that were occurring throughout the late Permian?
So I haven't done too much of the Permian stuff, but I know, but I've talked to researchers before about what they were doing in the Permian, and kind of like you said, looking at some of the marine fauna, more specifically the horned corals that were going extinct, and also doing some work on the ammonoids because we have a diversification of ammonoids, kind of getting onto the charts in the Permian. But then those specific ammonoids go extinct by the end of by the end of the Permian. So there's just a wild amount of research going on right now, looking at the climatic shifts and changes in the Permian, in those Permian rocks. But I personally haven't done any research.
Are those the goniotites? Yeah, that go extinct. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think the goniotypes go extinct, and I think they get replaced by the. Oh, I'm blanking on the ammonoid group right now. The
Yeah,
it starts with a C.
yeah, I'm trying to
Anyway,
think.
Anyway, yeah,
if,
brain fart right there.
if you are familiar with ammonites, they are very useful for biostratigraphy because they go through these very specific changes through time. So,
Okay. Oh,
yeah, this is one example of
ceratites.
that. There you go,
Ceratites. There we
ceratites.
go. Yeah.
So, yeah, there's some really distinctive things with ammonites. I know that. But then, like I said earlier, like you just have this massive change in reef systems where older reefs are dominated by brachiopods, which are clam-like animals, but not related to clams, and bryozoans and crinoids, which are crinoids. If you took a starfish and gave it a stalk so that it was hanging up in the air, that's basically a crinoid. I mean, actually, a starfish is if you took away the stalk from a crinoid and put it on the ground. But
I've
um,
got one right here.
Oh, cool.
I don't know if you can
Perfect.
see that.
Perfect timing. There you go. There's
Yeah.
your crinoids. And so that's what you're seeing in a lot of these reef systems. And then towards the end of the Permian, a lot of those groups start to decline. And then suddenly you have in the Triassic, I know this is the Permian episode and we keep talking about the Triassic, but this is a really important time for this kind of transition into modern oceans, where suddenly now after that extinction, you start getting your decapods. You start getting things like lobsters and crabs more often.
Right.
You start getting your scleractinian corals, which are modern day corals. So you start getting things more like brain corals, as opposed to these individual rugose corals. And some of those rugose corals were colonial, but not nearly as often. So you're just seeing these massive changes. Crinoids start to suffer and decline massively. So it's just this massive change in the oceans because of what's first the Amestian traps and then the Siberian traps, which are from Siberia, where it's just massive kilometers, square kilometers, cubic kilometers of lava being produced. And it's releasing all of these gases and it's releasing not just CO2 for raising the temperatures, but also things like chlorofluorocarbons or chlorines that are going to just strip the ozone layer. And so we actually see damage in certain plant pollens where it's like, yeah, no, this is consistent with extra UV radiation damaging these pollens. And so you get acid rain as well because of the acidification coming from sulfur being released. So it's just this massive event caused by runaway global warming, which is ironic because now the Permian Basin is where we produce so much of our oil.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, does anyone know anything about the paleobotany of the Permian and how plants took a big hit in the Permian extinction event?
That's a good question.
Because I'm no
That's
paleobotanist.
I'm not either, but that's the main thing I know is that at this point you still would have largely had gymnosperms as opposed to angiosperms.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't
Yeah.
have had flowering plants at all. Your fruit-bearing plants you wouldn't have had. Instead you've had pines, spruce, cycads. These I don't like the word more primitive, but earlier branching types of trees and other plants. There would have been no grasses yet because that's a flowering plant.
Yeah.
So it would have been a very different environment. And what we see immediately after this extinction is a massive spike in fern spores. And that's really interesting because that means basically everything else is dead. There's plenty of open space for these ferns to start growing. And so you see that a lot of times after, I say a lot of times, you see it after two of the big five mass extinction events. This one and the KPG after the impact that killed off the non-bird dinosaurs. And so you see this kind of thing happening when there's just a lot of decay because suddenly everything dies. And it does seem like this extinction was onset very quickly over the course of maybe just a few thousand or tens of thousands of years. I believe that there's actually a site in China which really well documents this. And what you're doing when you're trying to define stratigraphy for where's the Permian end and the Triassic start is you look for your essentially last appearance datum, which is okay, so we have this animal, this brachiopod that's throughout this entire section of rock, and then it disappears.
Right.
And so that's our boundary. This is the end of the Permian. And then you don't say, hey, this is the start of the Triassic. You only define the ends of periods. And it seems like there's a little bit of offset between the land and the marine extinctions, but you can still see that really well there. And it goes from being a very rich environment in this Chinese deposit to being almost devoid of everything. And it's kind of terrifying to think about that. Um,
I have
but
a plug for an awesome paper on this very topic, which is fascinating. It came out this year, and this is from a bunch of different. It's an international team, and I believe I think Michael Benton is on it, and I know, yeah, Peter Rupnarian, who's at the California Academy. It was a really interesting research. Is sort of guild structure research. There is the as you're saying, the biodiversity declines in these Permian ecosystems, and it's like unbelievable how many species you lose. But there's a really interesting thing where the guild structure of the ecosystem is like fairly intact till the end, which basically means that the nature of who's eating who in both terrestrial and marine ecosystems, it actually kind of stays the way it is until the early Triassic, which is really weird. So like in the early Triassic, the gill ecosystem is utter chaos. But then in the even in the latest Permian, when you're just like losing all of these different, especially invertebrates, the nature of the energy cycle is kind of the same. It's so I just read this paper. We can plug it. I can send you the link. But Peter Rupnari was just at CU Boulder, and he was just talking about this, and my mind was blown. And it's kind of in they're comparing that in the Cretaceous Paleocene extinction, and but looking at it not just from biodiversity and what group is being lost, but the structures of the ecosystem instead. Really cool stuff.
and I think that's really important for looking at modern extinctions too.
Yeah,
I think it's
totally.
Congreve, Falk, and Lambsdell wrote a paper about this that's the same similar subject, not directly looking at extinctions or a specific extinction. But when you're thinking about an environment, it's essentially all nested bowls. So you have like your whole ecosystem. You then have how different species are interacting. You then get down to your guilds and then your specific species. And you could spill a little bit of one bowl into another. If you lose one species, that's bad, but that could be spilled over into the guild or the feeding structure, trophic structure,
Exactly.
and the
Yeah.
different species might be able to take that over. But if you spill all of your species, you're kind of out of luck. Um,
Yeah.
and it's a great paper. They have some great graphics in there or figures in there that are really explain this much better than I am right now. Um, but that's the kind of thing you need to think about is you can lose one or two species, but that's not what's happening in this extinction. What you can do is you can look at the late Permian, and at least they've done this a lot in the marine realm, where you look at the late Permian and you look at all of the families that are there, not just species. So if you
Hmm.
have one species before the Permian extinction and then it's not there afterwards, it's extinct. If you have an entire family of species after the Permian or before the Permian extinction and it's gone afterwards, that means every species in that entire family is extinct. There's no more of them. So you can just take that kind of data and apply it to, well, how common should these things have been in the ocean based on their trophic level? So if it's filter feeders in reef systems, there's a lot of them. There's going to be a lot of different species of brachiopod, except now they're all extinct. Or maybe not all of them. A few brachiopods did make it through, but it's that same kind of concept. We're getting these very sudden changes where everything dies. And there's been some estimates of up to 95% of life in the ocean. So just wild to think about that anything lived, let alone just, you know, that anything lived, let alone just,
Yeah.
what we have today that was able to diversify into what it was, or what it
Yeah.
is now, rather.
Like when we look at the chondrichthyans, there is so much diversity on the Euchondrocephalon line that when we hit that end Permian mass extinction, you lose so much of that. Like you have your Eugenodoniforms like Helicoprion, even though Helicoprion died off in the Permian, but you still have members of that order that like barely limp on into the Triassic, but then they die out in the Triassic. You see like the Patelodont style tooth design that just dies off in the Permian. Nowadays, you really only have the Camariforms that are left within the
Yeah.
Yeah.
Euchondrocephalus line of things. So there's a huge decrease of diversity just from that Permian mass extinction. And then you have just things that like limp on from there. And surprisingly, the Neoselacians, which we saw in the Permian as being just super restricted in their diversity, they go into the Triassic and then they just start expanding out, but they weren't, like hyper successful. Like they didn't really take on a macro predatory role until the Jurassic, where you see like our crown group Neoselacians really start diversifying. You see Hybodonts, which they're around throughout the Paleozoic. They make it through and they wind up becoming more successful within the Triassic, but even still, they don't get huge. Whereas we're looking at helicoprine worlds on the chondrichthyan side of things within the Permian. You're talking about worlds that can get like 2, 3+ feet in diameter, which is huge.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. So
I get this is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so within the Triassic, the animals that wound up taking on those macropredatory roles, you see that within the reptiles, not within the chondrichthyans, which is a stark contrast between the Permian itself.
Well, and that's the thing is there's what's called the coal gap, which to get coal you need a very wet, very warm environment with a whole lot of plant life that can all get compressed in an environment where there's not a lot of oxygen, so it doesn't decay. And there's about 5 million years after this extinction where there is no coal anywhere in the world, so far as we know. And so it seems like, yeah, okay, this extinction took a long time to try and recover from. But as we keep looking, we're finding more things that suggest it wasn't necessarily like that everywhere. And part of that is you have things like very large ichthyosaurs starting to show up just a few million years afterwards, which means they were probably getting started in the late Permian, just to reach those kinds of sizes, the ichthyosaurs being these large dolphin-like reptiles. But then you also have the new site in China as well, where suddenly it's like, hey, look, this is just like a million years after this extinction, and we have large coelacanths, we have decapods, we have all of these modern groups that we were not expecting to see in a rich and abundant form so quickly. And this is a relatively new paper in the last year or two, but it's just wild to see this because it's basically at the equator, which was the worst hit area. Like if you're thinking about it, and this is from another paleo podcast, Paleo After Dark, but one of the hosts was saying it's equivalent to in the Paleogene extinction if you find the first animals under the crater. If you're thinking about the KPG extinction, it's like, no, this is the area where there should not be anything. And yet we have this wonderful refugia where you see all of these animals succeeding and surviving and doing relatively well. So there's these really weird areas, and there could be plenty of influences for that. I'd love to look at the chemical structures of that because maybe there's more freshwater influence, and so maybe the spring that was feeding that area buffered the acidification that was happening in the ocean, brought in more oxygen. There's plenty of explanations that could cause this, but it's just not what you expect in any kind of way. So we're finding out a lot more about this extinction, which is again arguably the most important extinction in Earth's history, and we're finding out more about it, and it's much more complex than we were first giving it credit for.
Yeah,
Should we talk about Lystrosaurus?
go for it.
Yeah, so basically, so in line with all this stuff and how weird and complicated this extinction is, there's this kind of bizarre thing that happens in the early. Well, it's not bizarre, but it's just kind of like um, it's jarring in the early Triassic across the continents that would have formed this landmass called Gondwana. You find just thousands and thousands of skeletons of this animal called Lystrosaurus. And Lystrosaurus is a dicynodont, which are the walrus parrot things, which make it into the Triassic and basically die out in the latest Triassic. But it appears that the landscape is just dominated by this one genus, which is that's never really like a great thing. That's definitely something traumatic has happened to the ecosystem. Um, so yeah, that is a holdover from the Triassic, but or sorry, from the Permian, and I just think that's kind of awesome to think of like this like vast landscape just covered in these weird little synapsid guys.
Hmm. And what taxa of that were related to those would have been from the Permian?
Yeah, so I think Diictodon proper is from the Permian, but basically the Diictodons in the Permian are pretty small, and they're mostly I think they're like burrowers. I think we have their burrows fossilized. But by the Triassic, you have things like Placerius in the Chinle, which is huge, and it's like this rhinoceros-sized animal. You have some gigantic ones in the Kuru Basin in South Africa. But back in the Permian, I think for the most part, those guys are pretty small, and they're living under the feet of the Pariasaurs, the Dinocephalians, and the Gorgonopsids, and all the really cool Permian critters.
Were those the ones in Walking with Monsters, the burrowers?
Yeah, and I
Those
think
things
I
were
think
adorable.
those are so cute.
I still
Um,
think the best named one of the Dicynodonts, though, is still Bulbasaurus.
Oh yes.
Bulbasaurus Phyloxyron. So it's Bulbasaurus because it has bulbous teeth, and Saurus, sure, it's not related to reptiles, but just because, like, a lot of these things are named that, right? And then Phyloxyron being the species roughly translates to leaf and sharp, like razor leaf or something. But that's because its teeth were also used to help, chop up the plants and stuff it was eating. Totally no reference to Pokemon at all.
Walking with Monsters was such a good series because
It was.
there
yeah,
Yeah.
because you when you're a young kid, you're watching all these documentaries and everyone focuses on dinosaurs. But then you have that one, and then you have also Walking with Prehistoric Beasts, which is after that end Cretaceous mass extinction, that focus on the animals that you don't see talked about as much, especially within the mainstream.
I love just from a filmmaking standpoint, the atmosphere of Walking with Monsters is so like creepy. There's this like sense of dread in it, which I
Yeah.
love. It's like it's so like everything is so off-putting, and the music's really good.
Yeah, especially when they're in the what was it, the Carboniferous rainforests.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Oh yeah. The giant arthroplora.
Hmm.
yeah. But then I think I'm sure you guys know the thing, but just for our audience, so the protagonist of that episode is a giant spider called Mesothele, but that's supposed to be a thing called Megarachne, which while they were making it, like turned out to be a Eurypterid. So they're like, "What do we do?" And they're like, "Well, we thought it was in this family, Mesothele. So we'll just have this spider be like an unnamed species of that family." And it's a really awesome looking creature, but that thing is actually supposed to be like in a river with a big paddle on its rear end. So
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's one of those Eurypterids that moved back to freshwater, like I was talking
yes,
about
that's right.
earlier.
That's right. Yeah.
I guess that's another thing we can talk about. So we've been focusing on the end Permian going into the Triassic, but what about the Carboniferous going into the Permian? What differences would we have seen with some of those invertebrates?
You definitely had kind of a higher oxygen supply. So it's like, I believe we also have the meganerids, those like large griffin flies, they make it into the Permian. I don't know anything about the larger arthropods, but I know we've got the griffin flies that make it into I think the early Permian.
Yeah, there's a fundamental limitation with arthropod body plans and the way they
Mhm.
breathe. We have lungs, so we can take in whatever oxygen is in the atmosphere and process it that way. When you're looking at arthropods, they don't have lungs the same way we do, at least most of them don't.
Hmm.
Some, like the
Right.
chelicerates, do have book lungs, which are similar but not quite as efficient. Um, but largely they're breathing through spiracles, which are these little holes in the exoskeleton. And the thing is, if they need more oxygen to power a larger body, you can make that spherical larger. The problem is at some point, that exoskeleton is supporting your entire body. If you put a bunch of giant holes in it, it's not going to support your body anymore. So when you're looking at the Carboniferous, there's these rich rainforests that are taking in all this CO2, pumping out this oxygen. You get massive arthropods on land. And then the Carboniferous rainforest collapse happens, the ice age starts, and a lot of that oxygen starts getting put back out into the atmosphere. And so suddenly you don't have as much oxygen for those animals to be able to survive. And so those spiracles need to shrink, but that also means that their overall body needs to shrink, and that means those spiracles are also shrinking. So there's a fundamental limitation, and we even see that today, where when you look at how much oxygen there is in the air, it's about the size that supports the largest, Goliath bird eater spider or the largest, Goliath beetles. It's they're fundamentally at the limitations of what their body can do.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I mean I guess it's aptly named the Carboniferous for a reason.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and we should probably mention too that so one of the we've been talking about the Siberian traps this whole time, which is this crazy series of lava flows in Siberia.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons the Siberian traps is as like sort of dangerous to the earth as it is because it's hypothesized that the Siberian traps were actually burning through these coal layers from the Carboniferous. So in the Carboniferous, like these rainforests, there's nothing eating the lignin in the trees. So lignin is I think it's a structural protein that's in plants today, and there's certain fungi that can digest it. And that's why it takes a tree a long time to decay, even in a wet environment, is that it has these like really tough structural bits that are hard for organisms to digest. It's presumed at this time in Earth's history that basically nothing can eat that. So the carbon that just sits there, it just kind of like builds and builds and builds and builds and pressurizes into these massive coal seams. And coal is usually full of things like arsenic and mercury, and it of course is like made of carbon. So if you burn it, you're going to get a lot of crap in the air. And so what the Siberian traps were probably doing is actually like bubbling up through the Earth's crust and burning through these ancient rainforest layers. And
That and there, oh,
oh, go ahead.
that
Sorry.
that and there were some gypsum layers in there, which is a
Right.
sulfur-bearing mineral. So that's where
Right.
you're getting a lot of acidic rain from as well. It's rough.
Yeah.
Rough time for the environment.
It's a nasty.
Unfortunately, none of the things we burn for power have any of those chemicals in them. Oh, wait.
No, not at all. Permian is like maybe the most that and like the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum are like maybe the two most important periods in Earth's history for understanding like what we're doing to the environment without getting into that too much. And I don't know enough about that to say a lot, but like the Permian has a lot of interesting connections to today's world, even though we don't have all the giant dragonflies and crazy world tooth sharks anymore.
Yeah, the ocean warming was wild in the Permian, based on isotopes of oxygen, which evaporate at different amounts based on how much heat there is, because the heavier ones evaporate less. It's estimated that at the equator, surface ocean temperatures were about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, so about 40 Celsius. So, I
That's
mean, if you're some
crazy.
animal living in that, you're basically getting sous vide, right? So it's makes sense that a lot of these organisms that did survive were living deeper in the ocean or potentially in fresh water where there might be more spring water coming in, helping to refresh that water, so it's not as significant of a environmental change. But that's also why when you're talking about the ratfish, the chimera type shark relatives, you're looking in the deep water for them now, and that's probably because that's where the ones that lived actually lived back then as well. Um, there's also I don't remember who it was, but I remember watching a talk by during the Royal Tyrrell speaker series where they were talking about lampreys and where do lampreys live? They don't live at the equator. They had a global distribution. Lampreys don't live at the equator now, and they don't live near the poles. And when we talk about this extinction, again, lots of heat right around the equator, so a lot of life there died. And the poles are where the ozone layer was going to get the weakest. So a lot of life there died. So there's these two temperate bands where lampreys still exist, and that's probably because those are the only ones that survive this extinction.
And it's funny you say this too, because when we look at animals that are just like hanging on by a thread, that used to once be diverse, they really do either seek refuge in two places. They either go into freshwater environments or they go deep sea. So like Scapanorhynchus in the Cretaceous, they were widespread throughout much of the world, and yet nowadays the mittocrinids, you're limited to just the extant goblin shark that's a deep sea animal. And then when we look at
Yeah.
hybidons, they were pretty widespread during the Triassic. When they eventually dwindled on, especially into the Cretaceous, they wound up being basically limited, not limited exclusively, but mostly found in freshwater environments.
Yeah.
Because again, that's where they sought refuge. They wound up getting displaced by like marine reptiles, true sharks, things like that.
And
Yeah,
that's
it's
another
pretty.
thing.
It's
And
okay.
that's
I was just
another
gonna
thing
say.
with an
Go ahead, Ezekiel.
And that's another thing with animals facing extinction, right? If the climate is changing, they don't necessarily adapt. They try and find that climate somewhere else. And if they can't, then maybe they adapt. And the third option is just they die.
Hmm.
So that's kind of one of those things that you need to think about when you're looking at modern day extinctions and applying it into the fossil record, right? Could these animals find somewhere to survive? If the answer is no, then they're dead.
Yeah. What are you going to say, Joel?
I just want to. It's just really wild, like finding a goblin shark tooth on like a beach, and you frequently find those Scapanorhynchus teeth, like in the Fox sandstone. It is so cool, and we've
Yeah.
missed that.
Yeah, I found a Scapanorhynchus tooth here in Arizona, believe it or not, in this
Wow.
Tasmanian, yeah. Yeah, I mean, granted, it's a frag. It's not a complete tooth. The place I found it, it's in a I believe it's a Manco Shale equivalent, but it's in a currently undescribed formation. I was out there for 2 days with a group of people from SPS. I found the only two teeth on that trip, on that 2 day trip out of everyone, and they were both fragments. So the preservation isn't like what it is in, say, Kansas or Texas, or even in Colorado. I've went there before, and you can get some really nice teeth over there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Come to Georgia and Alabama, we've got plenty. You can pull them by the handful.
Yeah, I've seen some of the Alabama stuff that like Chase pulls out, and I'm so jealous. I have to fight for every fragment of a Scapanorhynchus I can get. Well, with that said, I think that's a good place to wrap up the podcast. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you guys for joining. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, help this channel out because there isn't a ton for like really science-rich paleontology podcasts, and I think it's something that is a benefit to the paleontological community as a whole. So yeah, thank you everyone, and yeah, stay tuned for the next one.